Hello, everyone. Very good morning and welcome to Unacademy, a one stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So, let's start the discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen a total of 9 important articles, and wherever necessary, I'll be integrating PIB press releases into the discussion as well to make it a comprehensive discussion of current affairs. The idea is to ensure that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. But before we start, I have a very important announcement for those of you who are preparing for 2027 and beyond. If you're a beginner, I'm sure you must have a lot of doubts regarding how to approach your preparation. You may not be understanding the entire syllabus. You may not know what to read, what not to read, which books to refer, and what should be the strategy for your mains answer writing. So, to resolve all these doubts, we are conducting free online workshops. Today at 11 a.m., Sarmat sir will be taking up the second workshop. And if you want to join the session, please click on the link provided in the description box below. With this, let's get started and look at the first article. On page number 12, there's a detailed article on the super El Nino phenomena, which is already impacting Indian monsoons. You must have read news reports that this year the monsoon had been delayed, the onset had been delayed by a few days. And now reports are emerging that a massive rainfall deficit is being registered across the country. And even IMD's long period average forecast has been revised, and we are expecting the LPA to go down below 90% as well, which could potentially indicate a drought condition for several parts of the country. So, in this context, it's important to understand what is El Nino. Why is this particular event of this year is being referred to as a super El Nino, and how is it exactly measured? How does it influence weather patterns across the world, including the Indian monsoons? And can there be any relief for Indian monsoons? Can there be any counter effects which could counterbalance the negative effect of El Nino? That is something we'll try to understand. See, this article will help you understand the impact on Indian economy, Indian agriculture, why this forecast is crucial for fiscal planning, for agricultural policies. That is something we'll try to learn through this article. Now, according to the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, there's a 63% possibility of a very strong El Nino taking root this year. In fact, the signs are already present and the El Nino cycle has already started building up. So, according to estimates, we have already seen a rainfall deficit in the range of 35 to 46%. The IMD earlier last week had estimated that the monsoon rainfall across the country has seen a deficit of somewhere around 35 to 40%. Latest reports indicate the deficit must have jumped to around 45 to 46%. Now, this is quite concerning because, especially in states like Maharashtra and central parts of India, the monsoon has taken a back seat. Then, northern, northwestern parts of India are yet to receive or yet to see the onset of monsoon. And this can be very bad news for the Kharif season, for sowing of crops across the country, and it could have a detrimental impact on food security of the nation. This could also result in a cascading effect, resulting in a social and economic crisis. It could even aggravate the risk for wildfires. So, overall, the impact of a super El Nino is quite dangerous and alarming on the Indian economy. Now, El Nino refers to the abnormal warming of the waters of the Pacific in the central and eastern parts of the Pacific, that is closer to the Peruvian coast. When abnormal warming is noticed, this can significantly influence the wind patterns all the way from Australia to Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean, including the South Asia region. It affects the movement of the winds, how they pick up moisture, and it eventually influences rainfall patterns. It can result in deadly floods in some parts of the world. It can result in droughts and wildfires in many other parts of the world. Now, according to IMD, depending on the temperature deviation from the normal, the El Nino is categorized as a weak El Nino or a strong El Nino or a very strong El Nino. The term super El Nino is largely given by the media. It's a colloquial term. So, technically, experts grade the category of El Nino as weak, moderate, strong, or very strong. This depends on the temperature deviation from the normal. If the higher temperature being recorded in Central Eastern Pacific, in the surface waters over here, if it is in the range of zero point 0.5 to 1 degrees above the normal, then it is considered to be a weaker El Nino. If the departure is 1 to 1.5 degrees compared to the normal, then it's a moderate El Nino. In the range of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, it results in a strong El Nino. And anything beyond 2 degrees is categorized as a very strong El Nino. Right now, for 2026, the estimates by weather forecasting agencies across the world is that the temperature deviation could be as high as 2.5 degrees Celsius, making it a very strong El Nino year. That's why the colloquial term Super El Nino to refer to the current event. Now, when you look at the overall pattern of El Nino, there is a predictability attached to it. It actually follows a very consistent calendar. The warming of the waters in Central Eastern Pacific is noted in the spring season of the year itself. That is in the March April period. That's where the abnormal warming up of the waters off the coast of Peru is noted. This starts picking up throughout the year, leads to the peak of the temperature by the winter months, and then it starts subsiding very fast and weakens by the next year's spring season. This is the cycle, the consistent calendar that has been recorded with past El Nino events as well. So by March, April this year, the El Nino conditions were recorded. Now, higher temperatures are being recorded as we progress through the year. It will hit the peak during the winter months, which are experienced in the northern hemisphere. So, in the October, December, January period is when the temperatures would depart significantly from the normal in Central Eastern Pacific. And then by the next spring, you will see a quick receding of these higher temperatures, and most likely things come back to normal. It's very rare for a El Nino to continue into a second cycle. Based on past record, experts they tell confidently that usually El Nino lasts for one cycle, one calendar year, and beyond that, it does not extend into the next year. It's a very rare occurrence for that to happen. Now, when you look at past El Nino events, take for example the very strong El Nino of 1982-83. It led to severe drought and wildfires across Australia, causing widespread destruction. It triggered very dry conditions in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And this is known to cause a lot of wildfires, which contributes to air pollution and haze across Southeast Asian countries. We saw this recurring in 1997-98 as well, when Indonesia's air quality was significantly affected due to deadly forest fires that engulfed the region because of the dry conditions that were prevalent. Then, one of the latest El Nino events, which had a big impact on Indian economy, was the 2015 El Nino, which caused a major drought in India, affecting agriculture, resulting in food shortages even in southern and eastern parts of Africa. In fact, during the 2015 El Nino season, the Great Barrier Reef, known for its rich coral biodiversity, underwent mass bleaching due to higher temperatures that were recorded in the Pacific. So, this can have a global level impact. And definitely, India, being an agrarian economy, which is heavily dependent on monsoon for irrigation, and farmers who are heavily dependent on rainfall for sowing their crops, any such adverse event can have a detrimental impact on Indian agriculture. Now, when you look at the counter effects which can counterbalance the negative effect of El Nino, there are certain patterns which can possibly counteract against El Nino and bring some positive news for India. For example, there is one phenomena, uh, sea surface temperature related phenomena in the Indian Ocean known as the Indian Ocean Dipole or IOD. It refers to the temperature difference between western and eastern part of Indian Ocean. Right now, unfortunately, this is neutral. But if it moves towards a positive difference, if Indian Ocean dipole turns positive, it can help the wind currents, the southwest monsoon wind currents, to pick up more moisture and bring some rainfall to various parts of the country. So this can have a counterbalancing effect. Then we also have the Madden-Julian oscillation, which is a cloud and rain phenomena specific to the equatorial belt, where this system moves eastwards every 30 to 60 days and can also positively influence the Indian monsoons. But right now, even the Madden-Julian oscillation is not favorable. And that's what worries the IMD and India's policymakers. Until now, we haven't seen a positive Indian Ocean dipole and we haven't seen a favorable Madden-Julian oscillation as well. But however, the IMD is still hopeful because in another week, by the end of June, we are expecting a very strong Somali jet from East Africa to blow towards the Arabian Sea. Somali jet is a low level wind current that powers through the Arabian Sea and the western part of Indian Ocean from East Africa towards India. This can pick up sufficient moisture from Western Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea and can still add more fuel to the southwest monsoon, and it can bring rain towards interior and central parts of India as well, especially Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Odisha. They could all receive significant rainfall if the Somali jet picks up sufficient moisture. So right now, IMD is keeping its fingers crossed and hoping that the Somali jet kicks in to at least bring in some counterbalancing effect. Now, what is the economic, agrarian, and social impact of this? Because this is something which is very closely watched by policymakers, by the government itself. Now, when you look at all the past incidents from 1950, if you take the weather forecasting data and the historical documented data, over the last 7+ decades, there have been at least 24 to 25 El Nino years, roughly 2 dozen. Out of these 2 dozen El Nino events, in 15 years, below normal monsoon was recorded. And in 10 El Nino years, there was a severe deficit that resulted in deadly droughts. So right now, it's little too early to predict as to what could be the intensity of this impact because the actual peak of El Nino effect builds in the June to September period, and it's only in July that we'll get a clear picture whether India would face a deadly drought as we saw back in 2015 or like past incidents in 1972, 1982, where India has suffered deadly consequences because of El Nino effect. So by the month of July, there would be a much better picture, much better clarity for policymakers. Now, the IMD essentially classifies the rainfall, the quantum which is expected on the basis of long period average. If it is in the range of 96 to 104%, it's going to be a normal monsoon, which is good news for Indian agriculture. But now this is very unlikely. Below normal would be 90 to 96% of long period average, which was what was initially predicted by IMD, but later it has been revised following the delayed onset. But if it drops below 90% of LPA, it's going to be a deficient year. And most likely, India would be headed towards this scenario. Because let's say if you take 2015 El Nino and drought cycle, the rainfall estimate, it had fallen to 87 to 86% range, which is a clear indicator of a deadly drought. And most likely this year, it might drop below 90%, right? So it's not just about the total volume of water that is received through rains. That's not the only factor which matters for agriculture. It's about its distribution, how it is distributed over the monsoon season. Because farmers eagerly wait in the month of May and June to begin the sowing season. Now, if this is disturbed, if the onset gets delayed, It affects the sowing of the crops, and this will have a cascading effect. It will increase the cost of inputs. And if any abnormal rain occurs after the sowing, it could even destroy the crop. Or if farmers delay the sowing, it's very hard for them to anticipate and predict as to when the rains might be received. So it's about the distribution, not just the total amount of rainfall that is received. It's about the spatial and temporal distribution of rainfall as well. And the timing at which the rain arrives, it really matters for agriculture that's dependent heavily on rainfall. So, a deadly drought condition triggered by a significant deficit in rainfall can have adverse economic and social consequences. See, as they say, drought is a slow onset disaster. It's not an immediate catastrophe like earthquake or cyclone or tsunami, right? It builds up over a period of time, and eventually it will affect every part of the Indian economy, starting with the rural agrarian economy, starting with agriculture, which could affect agricultural productivity, affecting food security, which in turn could trigger inflation. And this sets off a vicious cycle, right? As it can increase poverty, it can increase agrarian distress, it can result in higher debt burden on farmers and push up even farmer suicides. It can have a detrimental health impact. The water shortage could result in scarcity across the country and result in over exploitation of the groundwater table. So it has a significant environmental impact as well. So that's the reason why understanding these processes, the interconnected nature of climatic and weather patterns, is very crucial for policy making. So please take up this mains practice question based on what we have discussed. Examine the impact of El Nino on Indian agriculture and fiscal planning. Because based on this, the government will have to plan its subsidy policies, the support it will provide for fertilizers or subsidies for power for farmers, or let's say waiving off the debt or announcing interest subsidy in order to support and help the farmers. So this requires significant, considerable fiscal planning and puts enormous pressure on the fiscal resources available to the government. Now, let's move to the next article and take up this important column from page number 14 that is focused on the G7. See, I'm sure most of you would know the composition of G7, but this article, it helps you understand the origin, the history of G7, in what context it evolved, what role has G7 been playing in managing the global economy and dealing with global geopolitical events. And it gives us an opportunity to talk about the latest G7 summit, the 52nd summit that was hosted by France, and briefly talk about the key outcomes of the G7 summit and what does it mean for India. Because India was one of the guest countries invited by France to take part in the G7 summit. So let's explore this topic. We'll go beyond the article and take a detailed look at the group of seven or G7. See, the group of seven has its origin in 1970s. But in the preceding years, there were few events that led to the formation of this organization. Though it's not a formal organization, it brings together the major industrialized developed economies of the world. The seven top economies: US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These are all like minded Western democracies that have aligned together, and it is essentially a grouping of the global north, not only to protect their own interests, but also to stabilize the global economy and supply chains and deal with geopolitical shocks that could disrupt global economy. So post Second World War, it was initially the United States which took up the leadership role to help in the reconstruction and welfare program of the world. The US had established itself as a predominant superpower, and it was at the forefront of providing loans, development assistance to several countries across the world, establishing its leadership role. But very quickly, the US realized that it cannot do this alone. Though US had championed the Bretton Woods institutions and through World Bank and IMF, it was not only controlling the global financial architecture, but it was creating significant influence for itself by channeling development loans and assistance and funds to countries of the global south. But by 1950s and 60s, the US realized that there are many external internal problems and US alone cannot deal with them. For example, the unnecessary military intervention in Vietnam had turned into a military diplomatic nightmare. And within US, there were large-scale anti-war protests, bringing pressure on the US government. This was also the period of the civil rights movement. So internally, the US was dealing with a lot of chaos and volatility and uncertainty. Externally, it was coming under increased pressure. Plus, the Cold War rivalry with Soviet Union was also draining, and it was creating challenges for American power projection across the world. So the US decided that it should align with its common allies, work with its Western friends, and then provide leadership and to retain that Western dominance. Because this was the era when all the newly independent nations, which were newly decolonized, they were coming together under the NAM, the non aligned movement, as a third world, under the leadership of countries like India and others. So throughout 50s and 60s, the foundation of the NAM was being laid. All the newly independent decolonized nations from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world were coming together and forming a strong collective under the Global South initiative. So the US decided to counter them because a decolonization approach, an anti-imperial approach, would counter Western dominance. That was the era when groups like G77 were taking shape, exerting pressure on Bretton Woods system to draw more loans, funds, and development assistance towards developing underdeveloped countries to support their welfare programs and initiatives. So as US found it difficult to navigate the world on its own, it created this alliance of like-minded Western democracies. But the main trigger, the immediate trigger for its establishment was the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the Arab states, Syria, Egypt, with support of other Arab states in the region, with the backing of USSR, attacked Israel over the Palestine issue, resulting in a major conflict in West Asia. This disrupted oil supplies as the West Asian economies imposed a oil embargo, crippling oil supplies and energy supply chains, which had a cascading effect on the global economy. And the oil embargo was essentially a reaction of the Arab states because Western countries like US and European nations were blindly aligning with Israel. So that triggered the West Asian response to cut back on oil production and also blockade oil supplies, triggering the first major oil crisis. So, following this in 1975, European nations led by France and Germany, they started bringing like-minded democracies together, and US also joined the initiative. And by 1975, the group of 7 or the G7 was taking shape. Initially, it was the group of 6 or G6 because Canada joined a year later. So by 1975, this group had taken a formal shape with France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Japan, and US coming together. And by 1976, Canada was also made a part of it, turning it into the G7. And since then, the G7 has played a key role in managing global conflicts in order to stabilize the global economy. Initially, the G7's objective was primarily to deal with economic challenges. But very soon it realized that economic challenges are a result of geopolitical events. Geopolitical shocks, especially wars and conflicts, they are the primary drivers of economic difficulties as they can disrupt supply chains and completely destabilize the global economy. So throughout 1970s, 80s and 90s, such events kept recurring, and each time the G7 played an important role to stabilize the supply chains and to protect the global economy. Take, for example, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the Britain Argentina conflict over the Falkland Island dispute, or look at the Iran Iraq war of 1980s, or the Kuwait war, the Gulf War as it is known as, of 1990, when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait. So these repeated conflicts across the world, they were impacting the global economy significantly, and Western interests were getting hurt. So each time the G7 played an important role to try and stabilize the global economy. So that role was very, very evident during these geopolitical shock events. But as the Cold War was coming to an end by 1991, it was quite evident that the communist bloc is likely to collapse and USSR is likely to disintegrate. So in 1991, the G7 even made an attempt to reach out to USSR, and the then Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was even invited and even participated in the G7 London summit. Following the collapse of USSR and the disintegration of Soviet Union, the G7 countries made attempts to bring Russia on board. They sent out a formal invite to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. And eventually in 1998, Russia joined the group and the G7 became the G8. With Russia's inclusion, the group had gained even more prominence. But however, in 2014, following Russia's hostility with the West and Russia's aggression against Ukraine, when it captured the Crimean Peninsula, when Russia took the Crimean Peninsula by force from Ukraine, it led to a permanent rupture between the West and Russia. So, following this, the G7, they basically expelled Russia. Russia was removed, boycotted from the group, and the G8 came back to its previous structure, the G7. And since then, the G7 has still been playing an important role, be it with the COVID-19 pandemic or the Russia Ukraine war. In fact, G7 is a key platform where Western democracies are aligning themselves against Russia, levying their sanctions, and trying to contain Russian aggression. They have also dealt with the Gaza war and the ongoing Israel Iran US Iran conflict and the blockade of Hormuz Strait. It also deals with other important issues, including climate change, governance of artificial intelligence, or promotion of sustainable development and inclusive growth to assist small, weaker countries through development finance. So, all these key issues of global governance are dealt with by the G7. That's why this grouping becomes a significant organization. Though it's not a formal organization, it's an informal group that brings together the most important powers. Now, what is interesting is that of late, the G7 has struggled to manage global events and issues on its own, especially since 2007 2008 global financial recession. The G7 realized their limitation because by then, the members of G7 themselves were looking at a stagnating economy and declining global influence. Look at Canada, Japan, Italy, France, or UK, Germany. They've all seen a significant decline in their diplomatic, economic, and military influence. And this was the era when several middle powers had emerged from India to Brazil to South Africa to UAE to Turkey to Saudi Arabia. So the G7 has not only started focusing more on G20, which has acquired significant prominence since the 2007 8 financial recession. Along with that, the G7 invites guest countries to participate in the G7 summit discussions. So, countries like India, Egypt, Brazil, South Africa, South Korea, even UAE and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they've all been invited as guest countries. For example, when Canada hosted the G7, India was invited. When Britain hosted G7 recently, India was invited as a guest country. And this time, France was the host in 2026, hosted the summit at Evian, where India was one of the guest countries. So, at the latest summit, the 52nd G7 summit, the global leaders have discussed important issues, including the ongoing Iran conflict or the war in Ukraine. They've expressed solidarity with some of the countries. They have spoken about freedom of navigation, which Iran has disrupted at Hormuz. They have highlighted the need to maintain global stability. They held discussions on AI governance and creating an ethical framework to promote the development of safe, sustainable, and secure AI, something which can be accessible to all the countries and powers. They have spoken about climate change. They've spoken about critical minerals and supply chains, how they can be strengthened. So, all these issues of global importance have been discussed, and a final declaration was adopted. A joint statement was brought out by the G7 leaders at the Evian summit in France. So, based on what we have discussed, please take up this practice question. The question is asking you to trace the role of G7 throughout the 20th, 21st century and how it has played a role during major geopolitical shocks and how it has stabilized the global economy, dealt with economic challenges. Yes, it has its drawbacks and shortcomings. There are some criticisms against it as well. It's a group of elite Western democracies, right? Often they have not shown a keen interest to resolve the issues of the global south. India itself has that complaint with them. But nevertheless, the G7 remains an important grouping. And since India is now a regular guest country as a guest participant, it provides us a greater voice to engage with these countries to project the voice of the global south. Now, let's move to the remaining articles in the newspaper. Let's take a quick look at the smaller articles. On page 1 and 11, there are articles related to the Hormuz Strait. See, as we had predicted, the MOU between US Iran is already being threatened and challenged by Israel. Israel, which had rejected the peace deal, has continued its bombing and its military campaign in Lebanon, carrying out large scale attacks in southern parts of Lebanon, resulting in a lot of civilian casualties. So, Israeli military aggression has continued, and Iran, which sees this as a red line, has said that it's going to blockade Hormuz again. The blockade was supposed to be lifted in the 30-day period. According to reports, a few vessels which were stuck in Hormuz for nearly 3 months, they'd managed to get out of Hormuz, and at least some sense of normalcy was coming back. But again, Iran has announced through its state media that the IRGC and the SEPA Navy will reimpose the blockade and they will not let any vessel pass through, as Israel has broken the terms of the deal. Though Israel is not part of the MOU, it's American responsibility to ensure Israel abides by it. Because as per the MOU, the war is supposed to stop on all the fronts, including Lebanon. And though Trump has been exerting pressure on Netanyahu, Israel has continued on its aggressive path. In fact, Israeli ministers and leaders have been making very, very controversial statements, stating that they will wipe out Israel and they don't care about the civilian damage and destruction as long as Hezbollah is wiped out. While it's understandable why Israel sees Hezbollah as a major threat, but carrying out disproportionate attacks against civilian territories and not caring about civilian losses is something which accounts as a war crime and a crime against humanity. So Iran sees this as a red line, and as long as Israel continues its aggression, it's unlikely that the issue is going to get resolved anytime soon. So that's why you can't hope for an immediate relief for the Indian economy. Right now, we are facing a major crunch with regard to fertilizers as the monsoon season has begun. And as we discussed, there is a deficit monsoon. Fertilizers will become all the more critical for Indian agriculture for this sowing season. So, initially, when Hormuz was blockaded, our first priority was to bring out the energy supplies to get the ships out, which were carrying oil and gas. Out of the several ships bound towards India, which were stranded within the Persian Gulf. We managed to take out at least around 15 vessels, restoring some of the oil and gas supplies to the country. Though India had diversified the oil gas supplies, we managed to get out around 15 ships during the blockade period. So now the focus is shifting towards bringing out those ships which are carrying fertilizers towards India. See, India depends heavily on other countries, especially West Asian countries, for urea imports, for diammonium phosphate imports, for NPK fertilizers. So countries like Oman, Jordan, Qatar, they all play a very, very important role, even UAE and Saudi Arabia as well. A large part of our fertilizer imports come from here. So, according to estimates, India's current requirement of fertilizer stands at 384 lakh tons. India's domestic production of fertilizers has slightly improved. The domestic production will take care of around 118 lakh tons of this requirement, which means rest of it, the majority of it has to be met through imports. Plus, we have to maintain a buffer stock as well, which is estimated at around 33% above the actual demand. So rest of it has to come entirely through imports. So as long as Hormuz remains blockaded, as long as the tensions and volatility continues, it will be difficult to get these Indian ships out. There are many ships stranded with several tons of urea, diammonium phosphate, sulfur, ammonia, and NPK fertilizers, which are desperately needed for the Indian economy. Until now, we have tried diversifying the supplies. We have sourced urea from Russia, Georgia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and other countries. We have been sourcing diammonium phosphate and NPK from Jordan and from Morocco, from Egypt, from US, and other countries. But that alone is not enough. We need the West Asian supplies very badly. So it all depends on how the Persian Gulf and the Hormuz Strait and the shipping would be managed. Because see, Iran has declared that any movement of any vessel across the Hormuz will require approval and permissions from the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, which Iran established during the war. Iran claims that the Persian Gulf Strait Authority is the only authority which has the legitimacy to grant permission for ships to navigate through Hormuz Strait. This goes against international conventions such as UN clause, UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which guarantees freedom of navigation. But Iran is insisting that if any vessel has to safely pass through without being targeted by IRGC or the SEPA Navy, they have to get the permissions. They have to apply on the Iranian website and get the required approvals. As of now, Iran has not been charging any tolls as such, though some reports say that illegal payments have been made. But going forward, Iran is saying it might levy insurance costs, which could bring in windfall profits for Iran, and it could increase the cost of shipping through the Hormuz Strait. So this can have a cascading effect on the Indian economy as the cost of transportation goes up, and the delay in fertilizer imports will hit our domestic production as well. So this creates a very challenging dilemma for India. Next, on page 11, we have an article related to the India UK Free Trade Agreement, or the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, that was signed in 2025. So the initial framework agreement was signed last year. Now the final details have been finalized, and it is all set to take effect from July 15th, 2026. The finalized agreement was signed just a few days ago, and the India UK FTA will take effect from 15 July 2026. But however, some experts have pointed out one concern. The concern is that this FTA does not specifically cover the investment sector. Generally, any FTA tries to address barriers to trade, be it tariff barriers or non tariff barriers to trade. So, under India UK FTA, both sides are they are providing reduced duties for each other's exports. They're also simplifying some of the regulations and removing the non tariff barriers to facilitate the easier movement of goods and services. Generally, an FTA will cover a separate agreement on investment as well, because this has been the norm with some of the recent FTAs we have signed, be it with New Zealand, be it with EFTA countries. We have a dedicated provision on investments where these countries are mandated to make FDI investments into Indian economy, which can help create infrastructure and jobs in the Indian economy. But India UK FTA doesn't have any investment provision that is explicitly provided. But the supporters of the FTA, they argue that there is no need for a separate clause on investments, because either ways UK businesses are very keen to invest in India, because see, UK has a stronghold in finance sector, right? London is a financial hub of the global economy. There are a lot of British companies seeking to enter the Indian market in a very big way. We already have several British companies operating in India, and it's also a fact that India has improved its ease of doing business. Today, a lot of FDI can enter the Indian market through the automatic route with almost minimal roadblocks, and red tapeism and bureaucratic discretion has been reduced through our economic reforms. It has become much easier to bring in FDI into multiple sectors through the automatic route, right? Even in other sectors, there has been a lot of deregulation which has been done with limited government control, which creates a lucrative opportunity and a route for channeling FDI or foreign investments into the country. So a lot of British investors and companies are very keen to invest in India, and they will not specifically look for a clause in the FTA as such, according to some experts. But a few are flagging the concern because in some of the recent FTAs, there are dedicated provisions on investment, which creates a binding commitment on the other partner. Now, here I will integrate a PIB press release. In fact, two PIB press releases. If you look at India's free trade agreement with the EFTA countries, the European Free Trade Association, it's an economic grouping of four European countries which are not members of European Union. It includes Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So in 2024, India signed the TEPA, Trade and Economic Partnership Agreement, with the EFTA countries. So under the TEPA, there is a binding commitment on the EFTA nations to bring in $100 billion worth investment over the next 10 years. Similarly, with the FTA with New Zealand, there is a binding guarantee to provide for up to $10 billion worth of investments over the next 5 years. So when these provisions could be included in the FTA with EFTA nations and with New Zealand, why hasn't India pushed for a similar clause with UK? That is a concern which has been raised. But some experts say it is fine. Either ways, British investors are eager to come to the Indian market, and India has relaxed provisions which can attract sufficient FDI. Now let's move to the next topic. On page number 6, there is a major development happening in South India, a new point of friction which is emerging between the state of Karnataka and the state of Tamil Nadu. This is with regard to the Kaveri River dispute, which is a long-standing dispute. Though it was resolved and the water sharing has been settled, a new proposed project by Karnataka, the Mekedatu project, has become the new point of friction. Because the other day, Tamil Nadu's Legislative Assembly has adopted a resolution against the proposed Mekedatu project. Government of Karnataka is pushing for this project from several years, and it is essentially a water management, balancing, and hydroelectric project. It's a multi-purpose project located on the outskirts of Bengaluru, right near the borders between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So it's in southern part of Karnataka on the outskirts of Bengaluru. On the Kaveri River at Mekedatu, this balancing river project with a water supply irrigation hydroelectric project is being proposed. Karnataka feels that this project is critical to meet the rising water requirement of Bengaluru. Plus, hydropower generation will also address the power issues of the state. And Karnataka argues that the project does not violate the previous award that was provided by the Kaveri River Dispute Tribunal, which was later settled by the Supreme Court, which is now implemented by the Kaveri Water Management Authority. So Karnataka is confident that the share of water allocated to Tamil Nadu would not be affected there would not be any reduction in the water flow into Tamil Nadu. But Tamil Nadu has raised concerns about the project being the lower riparian state, the downstream state. It naturally has concerns. So you can see the location of the proposed Mekedatu project, located in southern part of Karnataka, right on the border of Tamil Nadu, in the outskirts of Bengaluru. Now, when it comes to interstate water disputes, we have a constitutional provision, Article 262, that provides the parliament to provide by law to adjudicate any dispute of interstate river sharing issues that come up between the states. And it also has a requirement that the Supreme Court should not entertain. It should not entertain any such disputes and let the disputes be resolved as per the law provided by the parliament. So the parliament has enacted a law in this regard for interstate water dispute resolution. And when required, when adjudication is necessary, the central government, as per the law, will establish a water dispute tribunal. But however, states can even negotiate between themselves with the involvement of the central government to try and resolve these interstate disputes. When you look at the history of the Kaveri water dispute, it has always triggered passions and emotions on both sides, resulting in violence and protests as well. So initially, Karnataka believes that it was ready for talks, that it never wanted adjudication, it never wanted to take the tribunal route. It was Tamil Nadu which raised a demand back in 1980s to set up a tribunal, and Karnataka was opposed to this. Karnataka kept saying that we are ready for talks, we are ready to negotiate with each other, let's resolve it on our own. But as the matter turned towards adjudication and the central government set up a tribunal in 1990, the Kaveri Water Dispute Tribunal, it became a hostile environment between the two state governments. And it eventually became a political issue, right? That political parties exploited on both sides. They essentially exploited water as an emotive subject, and it turned up the passions on both sides, turning into a violent contest between the people of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu as well. So there is a history, a lot of bad blood between the two states over the Kaveri issue, right? Eventually, the tribunal passed an interim award back in 1991, with the final award being delivered in 2007. But Karnataka alleged that the award had largely favored Tamil Nadu and it had disregarded the interests of Karnataka. So, following this, there was a Supreme Court intervention and a final award has been settled where Karnataka is supposed to release around 177.25 TMC feet of water at Biligundlu, which is located right near Mekedatu. This is the last reservoir in Karnataka from where water is released from Kaveri into Tamil Nadu. So since Mekedatu is located over here, right, that's why Tamil Nadu has an issue. It's worried that the water flow into the state might be affected. So now this final award, which was adjudicated with the Supreme Court, is implemented and managed by the Kaveri Water Management Authority. So, given the fresh dispute which is rising, Karnataka has again said we are ready to negotiate and talk to Tamil Nadu, but Tamil Nadu is looking to take the adjudication route. And that's the reason why the Kaveri Water Management Authority has called for an emergency meeting on 23rd of June to ensure that the issue doesn't spill out of control, right? So let's see how the issue progresses. It's going to be a developing story and we'll continue to track this development. Now let's move towards the prelim section and let's take a quick look at the small articles. On page number 10, we have an article related to wildlife trafficking. See, in Northeast India, wildlife trafficking is quite rampant. Hunters, poachers, they target several animals, including threatened species, because there is a very big black market that exists in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Golden Triangle. In the Golden Triangle region that covers Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam belt, there is a very big black market for wildlife products, be it the bones of, let's say, a tiger, or the nail of a tiger, or the tusk of an elephant, plus many other wildlife products, which are byproducts of hunting and poaching. There is a big market here which extends to China as well. There's a lot of superstition attached to it. It finds application in traditional medicine in the region. And as a result, there is a very, very big demand for wildlife products. So there are criminal mafias, cartels that operate, that work with hunters and poachers, target threatened species, and the wildlife products are trafficked into the Golden Triangle region. So, in one such incident, the Indian security forces, primarily the Assam police special task force, they have intercepted a gang of traffickers, including a Bangladeshi, and they have confiscated the golden langur monkeys, which were being smuggled across the India-Myanmar border. Now, the golden langur is an endangered species on the IUCN Red List. The golden langur is endemic to northeastern parts of India, specifically in western Assam. It's also found in southern parts of Bhutan at the foothill of Himalayas. It's an old world monkey, a very rare species that's restricted to a very small region in Assam and Bhutan, and it's listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. It's also on Appendix 1 of the CITES Convention, which means any trade of this animal is completely prohibited. And also, it is protected under Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act of India of 1972. So kindly remember the protected status of the golden langur, its distribution, and why it is an important species. Next, on page 10, there's an article referring to the start of Kailash Mansarovar Yatra through the Nathula route in Sikkim. So, when it comes to Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, it's a sacred Hindu pilgrimage. It's also sacred amongst other faiths as well, in Buddhism and Jainism as well. Mount Kailash, located in Tibet, is attached with a lot of religious, spiritual significance across multiple religions. And facilitating this pilgrimage is a part of our cultural diplomacy with China, as Tibet belongs to China since its occupation in 1950. India has worked with China to establish a cultural initiative to facilitate the Kailash Manasarovar Yatra. It is essentially organized by Ministry of External Affairs in coordination with the Chinese government and the Tibetan administration. So there are two routes through which the pilgrims are taken. One is through Nathula, that is through Sikkim, which is a strategic Himalayan pass that connects Sikkim with the Chumbi Valley of Tibet. These locations can also be very important for your prelims. Now, the Nathula route is a easier route for pilgrims because much of the road is motorable. China has built very good roads on the other side. It involves very less trekking. So, this route is largely preferred for senior citizens. The MEA, which organizes the entire pilgrimage in association with travel operators, it ensures that those who are selected, especially senior citizens and those who are differently abled, those who can't really uh, undergo a hard trekking route, they are mainly sent through Nathula route, where you have a good motorable road, good facilities, hotels available. It's quite easy to reach the Mansarovar Lake and Mount Kailash. The other route, which is used for the yatra, is the Lipu Lake route from Uttarakhand at the tri-junction of India, Nepal, and China. So, in the Pithoragarh district of Uttarakhand, there is a direct access to Tibet through the Lipu Lake Pass. So, previously, this was a very hard route as it involved a lot of trekking, up to even 200 kilometers. So, this route is usually assigned for the younger pilgrims who have physical fitness. But right now, India has built a strategic road over here, the Darchula Lipu Lake Road, which has made the journey quite easy and involves just a limited amount of trekking on the Tibetan side, on the Chinese side. But Nepal has opposed to this because, see, Kailash Mansarovar Yatra had been stopped since the pandemic and the Ladakh military standoff between India and China. As India China relations had collapsed, the pilgrimage also had been stopped. Now, last year, after the resumption of good relations between India and China, Kailash Mansarovar Yatra has been resumed. And in 2026, the government of India is essentially conducting the pilgrimage on a very large scale. So, Nepal has already objected to it as it passes through the Lipu Lake route, which Nepal claims to be part of its territory under the Kalapani dispute. That's why these routes are very important. The locations that you see on the map can be very, very relevant. Next, there's an article on page 12 that refers to a very interesting development with regard to the 2011 Japan earthquake. I'm sure many of you must recollect the deadly underwater earthquake of 2011 that caused a massive tsunami as well, that resulted in widespread destruction in Japan and also resulted in a nuclear tragedy at Fukushima. The Fukushima nuclear reactor suffered a critical failure with the flood waters of the tsunami flooding the basement and destroying the backup power, which led to the melting down of the core and resulted in radioactive leakage. Now, with regard to this deadly earthquake, a new research has pointed out that one of the seismic waves, the SCS category of seismic wave, probably shifted Japan by 6 mm. The whole country has essentially been relocated by 6 mm, which is very, very significant on a geological scale, right? See, earthquakes induce usually two types of waves: the body surface waves, categorized into P and S waves, primary and secondary waves. Now, under the secondary wave category or the S wave category, right, where the shear force is exerted, you have a type of wave called SCS. These are the waves which basically go vertically downwards towards the core of the earth. When you take the epicenter, right, let's say the epicenter of the quake is somewhere here, a few kilometers below the earth's crust, right? So that point, that surface, this could be the focal point, the exact point where the energy was released, the tectonic activity happened would be the focal point. And the point vertically above it on the earth's crust, on the surface, is your epicenter. Now, these earthquake waves not only travel across the earth's crust, they could go inwards towards the core. And this wave, which travels vertically and hits the core and bounces back, is what is your SCS wave. It goes vertically downwards, hits the core and the mantle area, and bounces back, indicating that the core here, right below the core, you have a molten liquid state as well. And this wave, which comes back towards the crust, can cause a significant tectonic shift, right? And this is now classified as a new hazard because this can induce fresh tremors. It can even shift and dislocate a country and even move it a certain distance. In the case of Japan, it's believed that the earthquake shifted Japan by around 6 mm. So the SES waves are a unique type of waves released during earthquakes. It travels vertically downwards from the epicenter and the focal point towards the core, hits the core of the earth and bounces back, and it can cause a tectonic shift again. And this is now classified as a new hazard. Coming to the last article for today, the South American country of Bolivia has declared a state of emergency. UPSC tends to focus on countries which have seen a military coup or an emergency or a civil war. So, first, where is Bolivia located? Bolivia is a South American country sharing borders with Peru, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. See, Bolivia has been facing a severe economic crisis. It's dealing with a liquidity crunch, a forex shortage. The dollar shortage is quite severe. It has led to a big impact on the economy, right? It's seeking a desperate bailout from the IMF as well. And the government has been looking at economic reforms in order to abide by IMF restrictions so that it can get a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. So, as part of the reforms pushed by the IMF, the government has made some changes. It has cut back on fuel subsidies. It has brought in controversial land reforms and even reduced the wages. So, this has triggered large scale protests by worker unions. People are on the streets protesting violently, demanding jobs, higher wages, reduction in inflation because there's a shortage of fuel, food, and essential items. So, this situation has led the Bolivian president to declare a state of emergency. So this is what you need to know from today's newspaper. From PIB, there were no other articles which were too important, right? There were few which I have already integrated into our discussion itself. And on this note, I bring the analysis to an end. So if it was a useful and productive session, if you liked it, do press the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.